is so much to know about WLS Radio. There are so many incredible voices who have been on that station, so much history that was made by that station that it's impossible to cover all of it in this one show. It would be a 13-part documentary on PBS if we really tried to do that. But we're going to try and hit the highlights and give you an overview of everything history-wise and jingle-wise and programming-wise. So get out a notepad because there's a lot of information here. Let's see what we can do.
It's jingle time on Rewound Radio with Jon Wolfert.
Today we're going to focus on one of America's truly legendary radio stations. It's a station that's been around with the same call letters for over 97 years. So many generations of listeners have enjoyed it. Of course, I'm talking about WLS in Chicago. I suspect that you may be anxious to jump right into the Musicradio years of WLS and get to some of the jingles and the voices you remember, and we'll get there. In fact, in the second hour of the show, as I told you, we'll be joined by our special guest, John Gehron, who was the program director and later the general manager of WLS during much of that era. But before that, I want to share some of the fascinating early history behind WLS, because you've got to know where we've been to appreciate where we are. So in one sense, our story really begins in 1886, when a guy by the name of Richard W. Sears founded the R.W. Sears Watch Company in Minneapolis, Minnesota. His idea was to sell watches by mail order, and the following year he relocated his business to Chicago and hired a guy named Alva C. Roebuck to repair the watches. In 1889, Sears sold the business, but a few years later he founded another one with Roebuck, which in 1893 came to be known as Sears Roebuck and Company. And at that time, farms and small rural villages that had no convenient access to retail outlets, they usually bought supplies, often at very high prices and on credit, from local general stores. Now, those stores had a narrow selection, and the prices were often kind of negotiated by the storekeeper. And Sears took advantage of all this by publishing mail-order catalogs, you see, that featured a wider selection of products at clearly stated, usually lower prices. The company grew phenomenally based on the loyalty of their small town farm customers. Well, once commercial radio began in the early 1920s, Sears Roebuck bought time on radio stations to connect with their customers, and by the winter of 1923, Sears decided that they needed their own station to continue that relationship. So on April 9th, 1924, Sears signed on 500-watt WES, which stood for World's Economy Store. They were working from their own studios there in Chicago. And after a few days of experimental transmissions, the station officially went on the air on April 12th, 1924. And on that evening, pretty much at the last minute, Sears changed the call letters to WLS Radio. And the call letters stood for World's Largest Store. The station was at 870 on the dial back then, and they broadcast with 5,000 watts. Now, the 1925 Sears catalog explained the purpose of the station this way. They said, WLS was conceived in your interests, is operated on your behalf, and is dedicated to your service. It is your station. They were talking to the farmers. Now, even though the call letters stood for World's Largest Store, Sears only owned the station for 4 years. In September of 1928, Sears Roebuck sold the station for $250,000 to ABC. No, not that ABC. This was the Agricultural Broadcasting Company. The Prairie Farmer magazine was the majority stockholder of that company, and the Prairie Farmer, you see, was a publication designed for rural America. The paper had covered the station's sign-on in 1924 and had even purchased airtime on WLS for several years. And in March of 1931, WLS received authority to begin broadcasting with 50,000 watts of power. At night, that legendary signal could be heard almost coast to coast, and it was responsible for the success of one of the earliest shows on WLS. Let's talk about that for a minute, because that's pretty fascinating too. On Saturday, April 19th, 1924, just 1 week after the station began, WLS aired the first edition of the National Barn Dance. It was a live music, comedy, and what the station called down-home entertainment kind of a show. Starting in the 1930s, you see, WLS was an affiliate of the NBC Blue Network, which started carrying the barn dance in 1933. So if you want to get an idea what it was like to listen to WLS on Saturday nights, here's the beginning of the National Barn Dance show from 1942, in which they were celebrating their 9th anniversary on the network, even though it was actually the 18th anniversary of the show itself. It began, as always, with a song from the Hayloft Gang.
Mother and Dad and the whole family. Well, folks, that old harvest moon is shining down extra bright on the old red barn tonight, and for a very special reason. Yes, the Alka-Seltzer National Barn Dance Gang is celebrating its 9th birthday. Its 470th Happy Hayloft Party from the old WLS Hayloft in Chicago. Folks, and join our 9th birthday. We're celebrating it with a harvest home party. Oh, say, the old hayloft is going to shine tonight, folks. So come on, boys and girls, start shining. Hayloft will shine tonight, hayloft will shine. Hail to our birthday party, hail on the night. 9 years of friendliness, all right in line. Get the numbers 10, here we go again. Hayloft will shine. Everybody swinging down the lane. Everyone in Hayloft, singing like a prayer.
And it went on and on. In a similar vein, the WLS National Barn Dance. And just as an aside here, for many years the show was sponsored by Alka-Seltzer, and the commercials were read live with the band providing the music in the background. Again, from 1942.
You know, friends, we're great believers in the idea that credit should be given where it is due. And to you Barn Dance listeners goes the credit for this program celebrating its 9th anniversary tonight. It is your loyalty to this program and to Alka-Seltzer that have made this possible. And so to the countless thousands of you who are Alka-Seltzer users, we say thanks a million for your friendship, past, present, and future. And those of you who have yet to become acquainted with Alka-Seltzer, we say try it just once. Ask your druggist for Alka-Seltzer the next time you want real relief for a headache, a touch of acid indigestion, muscular aches and pains, morning after misery, or for that dull, achy feeling of a cold. Remember, you can get Alka-Seltzer at all drugstores in 30 and 60-cent size packages. Also by the glass at any drugstore soda fountain. And when you go to your druggist friends, remember that next week is Nationally Advertised Brands Week. Look around the store and see what nationally advertised products you need that he can supply. You'll be doing yourself and him a favor.
So next time you're at a soda fountain, be sure to request Alka-Seltzer by the glass. See what kind of looks you get. Now, I actually timed that spot. That commercial break was exactly 60 seconds. live announce, live music. Those guys were pros. Well, the network canceled the broadcast of the National Barn Dance in 1952. The show continued on the air on WLS, though, until 1959, and then it actually moved to WGN Chicago. But it finally left the air completely in 1968. But the National Barn Dance was one of the most popular and longest-running country and western live shows in history, second only to the Grand Ole Opry, which started a year later in 1925 at WSM in Nashville. Well, for many years, WLS had to share its 870 frequency with another station. For a quick recap of that story, here's WLS alumnus Jeff Davis.
In 1924, WLS shared its broadcast floor at 870 with WCBD. But gee, at 28, WCBD moved to 1080, and WENR, sometimes referred to as Wiener, took its place. And from there came a race to see which station could get all the time. In 1930, a legal fight ensued with WLS and WENR getting half the time each, 50-50, which was not nifty because it was WLS some of the time and WENR Wiener the rest of the time, which confused some of the listeners all the time. In 1931, WLS was 50,000 watts, and on March 29, 1941, WENR and WLS moved to 890 on the AM band. It was referred to as Moving Day all across the USA because other stations moved too. In 1954, WLS was signed to 890 full-time, and the owners decided wisely to keep the WLS name instead of making it WENR, thankfully, because today we would be known as, instead of the Big 89, the Big Wiener. And that's the dial story in a nutshell.
Thank you, Jeff Davis. That moving day that he mentioned was the day when the North American Regional Broadcasting Agreement took effect, the NARBA. It was March 29th, 1941. Now, we often talk about stations moving around on the dial at that time, and it's because of the Havana Treaty, which was signed by the U.S., Canada, Mexico, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti to better coordinate the use of radio frequencies in North America. And as a result of that, WLS moved to 890, where it is today. Now, before we get to the more modern era of WLS, there is one more piece of history I want to touch on. You've probably heard of the Hindenburg disaster. The Hindenburg was an airship filled with hydrogen. Good plan. It had left Frankfurt, Germany 2.5 days earlier and burst into flames while trying to dock at the Naval Air Station in Lakehurst, New Jersey. It was destroyed in seconds. Perhaps you've heard the famous audio report.
It's starting to rain again. The rain had slacked up a little bit. The back motors of the ship are just holding it just enough to keep it from... It burst into flames. Get it, Charlie. It's crashing. It's crashing terrible. Oh, my. Get out of the way, please. It's bursting into flames and it's falling on the mooring mast, and all the folks believe that this is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's like 400 or 500 feet into the sky. It's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the frame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the passengers feeding around it. I can't talk to people.
Oh, the humanity. It was May 6th, 1937, and that was the voice of Herbert Morrison. He and engineers Charles Nelson had been sent to New Jersey by WLS to cover the arrival of the Hindenburg for delayed broadcast. The report wasn't broadcast live from Lakehurst because they were experimenting with field recordings on huge acetate discs. After the disaster, they realized the gravity of their recordings as they found themselves being followed by German SS officers.
Very interesting.
So after hiding out for a few hours, the two managed to make a clean getaway. They got back across the country to WLS. That report aired the next day on WLS and was carried nationally by NBC. It was the first time that recordings of a news event were ever broadcast. Thank you, WLS. All right, but by the end of the 1950s, the prairie farmer decided it was time to sell WLS to ABC. Yes, this time the American Broadcasting Company, ABC. They were ready to buy it. They already had Channel 7 in Chicago and had begun to apply for a license in the new FM radio band. So by March 18th, 1960, the Prairie Farmer Publishing Company and WLS Radio became wholly owned subsidiaries of ABC, and the sound of the station changed quickly afterwards. On May the 2nd, 1960, at 6 a.m., WLS went full-time top 40 after 36 years of broadcasting farm information and polite entertainment, country music, and the National Barn Dance. Mort Crowley was the first disc jockey under the new format, and believe it or not, the first song played was...
There's a man in the funny papers we all know. Get 'em, man, like
Hipsville on Rewound Radio, Alley Oop by the Hollywood Argyles, the first record of the bright new sound on WLS. That's the station we're honoring here today as part of
Sunday with Jon Wolfert on Rewound Radio.
And do not forget that next hour we will be joined by John Gehron to talk about his experiences at WLS and some of the other stations that he was at before and after. So that'll be coming up about 30 minutes from now. But for now, let us get back to our history of WLS. Sam Holman was the first program director of the new WLS sound, and he added a new package of jingles for the station, which were done by the Anita Kerr singers.
Number 15, track 28.
So, 1, 2, 3.
The bright sound of music that you like best is heard all over the great Midwest. Everyone's choice is the musical voice of Chicago, of Chicago. The station with personality, WLS. It's understandable why most people tune to 890 WLS, the station with personality. The Loop, Lakeshore Drive, North Side, West Side, South Side in Chicago. It's WLS.
So who is Anita Kerr anyway? Well, she's really Anita Jean Grilly, and she's now 93 years young. Anita was born in Memphis, Tennessee. In 1947, she married Al Kerr. And, because there's always a radio story connected to everything on this show, they moved to Nashville so that he could take a job as a DJ on WKDA. Anita Kerr was a singer, an arranger, composer, conductor, pianist, music producer, and the performances of a vocal group she organized in Nashville got the attention of the program director at WSM in Nashville, who hired her to lead and arrange a choir on the station's Sunday Down South show. Eventually, Kerr and her singers performed 5 times a week with Jim Reeves on his radio show at WSM. This led to the group being used to sing backup on many records produced in Nashville. In fact, the Anita Kerr Singers, or the Jordanaires, sang background on just about every Nashville hit in the late 50s and the early 1960s. Using Anita Kerr's arrangements, those singers can be heard on